State University. She teaches in sociology and global urban study. And she has quite some publications, as I know, including 2 books in the, about Chinese city. And I know that she also had quite some articles in the India and China competition, like Shanghai and Bombay, and one article. Another article is about the land acquisition and Xingu and Wukan and Guangdong. So today I think this talk is part of his the theme of her upcoming publication on India and China and some kind of urban studies there. So today's talk is about how India and China govern their cities. I give the time to Professor Len. Okay. Do you want me to give her a big hand?
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I got to Delhi last night. I live in Chicago. It's a very long flight, but I feel well.
And you will sit or stand?
No, I'll just stand and move around. So I don't need the microphone.
So, no, ma'am, but this is for the camera recording.
For the recording.
Yeah, so
I don't have a pocket, so should I just hold this?
Yeah, if you're comfortable.
Okay, so let me put this on. Okay. Here is okay. Okay, I know this very well because I use this for my own teaching back in Michigan. Okay, so again, thank you for coming to my talk. So for the last few years, I've been working on a book comparing cities in China and India, and today I'm going to share with you some of the findings from the book. So you were asking me where this is. This is Shenzhen. Shenzhen is probably one of the top 5 cities in terms of GDP, not in terms of population in China. And in the 1980s, there was basically nothing here. Ying Hong is from, Ying Hong lives in Shenzhen, so he knows the city very well. But Shenzhen is a little bit unusual because it's one of the 5 original special economic zones, which means the city had over the years many favorable policies, but also subsidies from the central government. And that's why the city has grown so fast in a relatively short time period. So today, Shenzhen has more than 10 million people. It grew from a fisher's village to a mega city in less than 30 years. So back to my book. So in the book, I'm interested in just one big question, which is how the cities in China and India are governed differently. We know there's a lot of differences. China is not democratic and India is democratic, so that's a big difference. But there are also many other things going on in addition to the different political regimes. So let me start with some basic background. So I'll start with this slide. This is a very misleading slide, and I will explain why. So the figures are from the census bureaus of the 2 countries. It shows the different urbanization rates for China and India. And as you can see, until the 1990s, more or less the 2 countries were had the similar levels of urbanization rates, less than 30%. But this year, 2019, China has probably 59.8%, almost 60% of the country's population is urban. And India, the urbanization rate has been stagnating around 33%. So there's a big gap, and the gap is widening in the last 20 years. But this is a very problematic comparison because the two countries use very different definitions for what is urban and when who is counted as urban for the census purpose. So the big picture here is that China has been using a very flexible definition for what is urban, what counts as urban. It's so flexible, so a large number of rural towns, rural areas are counted as urban by the Census Bureau, and then the people living in those places are counted as the urban population. But India is probably one of the few countries in the world that use a very strict urban definition. So you probably know this. So it's based on population size, but also population density, and then also gendered employment. So 75% of the local male population has to be employed in non-agriculture jobs. So that's the third criteria. So anyway, so if you look at the census, China is much more urbanized than India, but the actual picture is a bit complicated depending on how you count what is urban. And if you look at the spatial distribution of towns, cities, and small towns, you will see that this is, so India, the cities and also towns are evenly distributed across the country. And for China, there are more big cities, and most of the cities and towns are in the east part of the country. There are very few towns in the west part of the country, in Tibet and Xinjiang province. So, so it's the same point. When we say India is less urban than China, we have to be critical by what we mean by urban. So, and very briefly, I'll talk a little bit about what are the drivers for urbanization or urban population growth. So for China, it's the migration, rural to urban migration, and everybody knows about probably the hukou system, which was reformed in the 1980s to allow people to move from the countryside to cities. So rural to urban migration is the main driver for the Chinese case. And for India, it's the second one, actually. The migration has been happening for centuries, but some of urban scholars working on India have evidence, very concrete evidence, that right now the main driver for urban population growth is not migration in India. It's in situ urbanization, which means people are not moving, but the places where they live are changing from agriculture to a non-agriculture jobs or occupation. For example, this place, so on the way from Delhi, we observed from the car. So this is I think, I don't know, but my sense is this might be a census town. It means it doesn't have a local municipality, but it meets the Indian census requirement for what is urban. So census towns are rapidly urbanizing small towns. And some people estimate that 15% of the urban population in India lives in the census towns. And then the third one, reclassification of rural places to municipalities. So this is happening in both countries, which means somehow the state or the central government approve a status change from rural to urban, then that locality can have a municipal government. So, so this part, the last one, is happening in both countries, but it's happening at a much larger scale in China than in India. And I can give you some numbers. So for the last 20 years in India, from 2000 to 2019, this year, there are about 200 places that have changed their status from rural to urban. But for China, it's tens of thousands. So rural towns, townships, also counties, they lobby, they make a petition to the provincial government to have a municipal government, and then somehow their different provinces, provincial governments allow them to change their status. So this is quite much more significant in the Chinese case. So these are different drivers or reasons behind the fast urban population growth in both countries. So, so for my book, I'm asking this question: how differently the cities in China and India are governed? And normally, when people compare China and India, there's a tendency to jump to the conclusion, which is, okay, India is the largest democracy in the world, and China is still under the single-party rule, and therefore, things work differently. And I don't dispute that. I agree with that. But in the book, I argue that there's much more beyond regime types. And my central argument is that in the Chinese case, policy making, but also implementation, depends a lot on local territorial institutions. For example, the hukou system. I call it a territorial institution because the hukou system basically distributes social welfare according to localities where a citizen is registered physically. And then another example of the local territorial institution is the evaluation system for the officials, which is based on GDP, but also environmental record in their jurisdictions. So the local officials in China get promoted if they have a good GDP number and if they don't damage their local environment too much. So it's called the green GDP. So now the environmental evaluation is quite important. And why is that territorial? Because the local officials don't need to care what's going on outside their jurisdictions. They only need to work, they don't even need to collaborate with the there's no incentive in China to collaborate across jurisdictions because the officials don't get credit for collaborations. So that's another example, and I can give you a few more examples later. And for India, urban governance or policy making implementation is not based on territorial institutions. And the territorial institutions in the Indian case are quite weak. So municipal governments don't have much power, and municipal governments also don't have resources to make change. And instead, to push through policies, projects, what's at stake here in India is alliance building or coalition building between public, private, but also civil society actors. So it's more contingent and also more precarious. So, so that's what I argue in the book, this difference between depending on local territorial institutions and more coalition building. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but I am confused at how do you define territorial land association? Because are you saying this concept territorial, you're using it to understand the identity of the policymaker? Is that what is your argument? Or is the word territorial about the processes of urbanization?
Okay, no, that's a fair question. So what do I mean by territorial? So people use the term territorial politics to mean very different things, and I'm not going to give you the literature review. So how I define the term, so it basically means the distribution of welfare and also benefits, also resources among localities. I was talking about the Hukou example, so I think that's a very typical territorial institution. That's what I mean. It's not that complicated. So in the book, I looked at a number of cases to just show the difference between the territorial and association modes of governing cities. The first case is housing, and specifically slum redevelopment. And my two cities, case study cities, are Mumbai and Guangzhou. Guangzhou is a very big city, not far from Shenzhen and Hong Kong. And then the second one is on land grabs. And here I compared two protests. Yinghong just made a short introduction. Singer, I think everybody knows where it is, in West Bengal. And then a small village outside the city of Guangzhou called Wukan. There was a big protest because of land disputes back a few years ago. And then my third case study is air pollution in Beijing and Delhi, and how the local government is trying to control reduce the pollution level. So I'm not going to talk about all three cases in great detail, so I will give you a very short introduction of the first two, and then today I will maybe spend more time on the third, air pollution. So very quickly, the first one on housing, so slum redevelopment. So I compared urban villages. So urban villages are not slums, but they are informal settlements. These are pictures of the same village in the city of Guangzhou. The location is very central, right in the middle of the central business district. For almost 20 years, the municipal government has been trying to demolish the village, but some of the locals have managed to resist. And it's quite remarkable because in most cases, if the local government wants an urban village to be demolished, then it's gone overnight. So this is a very unusual story. So in general, the policy, official policy is that the local villagers can work with the developer, and then the developer demolish everything, replace or relocate people somewhere else, and then they can have access to the land, and then they build like these high-rise buildings. So, so the winners in this case are developers. Some of the villagers, they get a lot of compensation, and also the city government. And the losers are most of the residents, so they are tenants. So when demolition happens, the tenants don't get compensation at all. And for almost every urban village, more than 90% of the local residents are tenants. So by law, they are not entitled to anything. They don't get any protection. And then the comparative case I looked at is a slum, a very large slum area right outside the international airport in Mumbai. If you fly into Mumbai, you can't miss it. So, so in this case, also almost 20 years ago, the state government of Maharashtra has been trying to resettle some of the residents in order to expand the airport, but also build some commercial facilities, shopping malls, office towers, and then residents didn't want to move. So for both projects, they are stuck. On one side, you have developers at different levels of the government, and on the other side, you have resisting families. So the comparison here I'm making is on compensation, and see how that is negotiated. And the main difference is for the Indian case, you probably know this already. So the official criteria for compensation is based on just an arbitrary date, January 1st, 2000. If people can show some paperwork to prove that they've lived here since that date, then they are entitled to compensation. But that date can be negotiated. So if you have connections with the state government or with developers, then even you can't show the proof, you can still get compensation. So who can get compensation, who can't, it really depends on connections, kickbacks, and how you mobilize your connections. And for the Chinese case, there's a number of territorial institutions at work, and they basically define the boundary of those who get compensation and those who don't. So one is hukou, if you have the local hukou, but that's not the only one. Another one territorial institution is the membership in the village company. So all Chinese urban villages, almost all, maybe not all, but most urban villages in the south of the country are incorporated as shareholding companies. So if you are a member, then you are entitled to the compensation. So that's the difference. In the Chinese case, it's these different policies based on specific localities that matter, but you don't see any examples of that in the Mumbai case, but instead NGOs work with the residents and they try to modify the date. So that's what I mean by associational. Very briefly, I'll just talk a little bit about the land protests in Singer and Wukan. This is a picture from China, not from Singer, not from Wukan, and that is actually from from Singer. I took that picture. So in both locations, something very similar happened. The government tried to take land from the peasants and people. Some people, not all, but some farmers, rural families didn't agree, and then they mobilized. They organized protests, and they partially blocked the land deal. And you probably know that in the Singer case 2 years ago, the Supreme Court of India ruled in favor of the resisting farmers in that. Hi, hello. So I'll show you some pictures. This is from New York Times, a very iconic image of almost the whole village was mobilized, and then they made a number of demands. So they wanted their land back. That's the first demand. And second, they also want a new local government because the former village government was corrupt. Then the villagers wanted to elect new leaders. These are some pictures for the Singer protest. And you probably know the story very well. So in this case, the protest was led by a political party, the TMC, China Mo Congress Party. And so the party really used the protest to win the state level election in the year of 2011. So the difference between the two cases, and that goes back to my larger thesis. So in the Chinese case, the target of the protest was very focused. The protesters targeted only the village government. So they said very clearly to the press that they support the Communist Party, they support the central government, the provincial government, and all they want is the change in the leadership in their village. They don't care about what's going on outside their village. While they were protesting, there were activists coming to that village, Chinese village, from all over the country. So they wanted to network with the villagers, share experience. But the villagers said no. They said, we are not democracy fighters. We just want our land back. So they mobilized also locally. Almost all the protests took place inside the village. But in the single case, the protest targeted not the local level, but the state government. And the ruling party back at that time was the Communist Party of India, Marxist. And because of the protest, the left front government in West Bengal lost the election. And also, in terms of the mobilization, they mobilized outside the village, all across the state of West Bengal, and even nationally. So that's another major difference. So here, in the Indian case, there's strong political party intervention. And that's one example I use in the book to show the associational approach, associational types of mobilization. So now I'm going to talk about the third case, the air pollution. Gate of India, Temple of Heaven, and you can't see anything in both pictures. So both Beijing and Delhi are very, very polluted. So while I was researching on the book, every time when I came to India, people would ask me, so which one is better, Beijing or Delhi? And my answer has changed over time. 5 years ago, Beijing was worse, Delhi was better. And today, the air quality, Delhi is much worse than Beijing. And, and I will show you why, what happened in the last 5 years. So this is an article from Times of India about what Beijing has been doing to reduce air pollution and why the numbers, all the pollutants, the level of air pollution has gone down so dramatically. So let me start with the sources of pollution. This is a picture of the expressway near the Beijing International Airport during the October 1st national holiday. So everybody is trying to have a vacation, getting out of the city, and big congestion, very, very, very congested. So emissions from cars, so that's the number one source of Beijing's air pollution. And the second is coal burning. So Beijing is surrounded by coal mines, big coal mining provinces. And therefore, the air quality has always been pretty bad. So in general, there are two phases in the city's fight to clean up its air, before and after 2009. So before 2009, there were some efforts made by the government, but the efforts were not systematic and they didn't have much effect. And after 2009, the government, both Beijing but also the central government, has allocated a large sum of money, hundreds of billions US dollars, to just cut back air pollution. So what happened in 2009? The US Embassy installed an air monitor on its rooftop and started tweeting the real-time air quality level. And some Chinese residents followed the US Embassy's tweets. And then the numbers were shared on Chinese social media. And then people compared the numbers from the US Embassy with the numbers from the local government. And there's a big difference. And people got very upset. And they wanted to know the real level of pollution they were exposed to. So people became really upset, and then they demanded action from the government. And then basically the crucial period, 5 years, from 2013 to 2017, there was a large number of legislation, also environmental laws passed, and also out of these laws, different regulations came with substantial state funding. So, for example, do I have a number? Okay, so in the year of, in this 5 years, so 277 billion US dollars. So that was the amount of state funding provided from the central government to cut air pollution. So a lot of policy action, but the main mechanism for implementing these different policies is this system called target responsibility system. So this is another example of the territorial approach to governance. So how does it work? Let me just explain what this picture is. This is not in Beijing, it's in a nearby conference called Hebei, a very dirty, heavily polluted province because the economy is a little bit backward, so the province depends quite a bit on the heavy industries. So this is a meeting for the local officials, provincial, but also municipal officials. So basically, the Chinese way to deal with air pollution is to set a time-bound target, which is 30% reduction in PM 2.5 level. PM 2.5 is a measure of a pollutant in the air. Then that national target is disaggregated among the provinces. So each provincial chief has to have a goal. And then for this province, for example, the provincial chief would call all the mayors in his province together for a meeting. Then every mayor would set a goal. So that target, provincial target, is disaggregated among the different cities. So it goes down from the top to the bottom, down to the district level. And then the local officials are evaluated at the end of the year to see if the air quality has met the goal. And then in 5 years, if they have reached the 30% reduction, that general goal. So that's how the target responsibility system works. And it's very effective in the short term because officials, they want to get promoted. So they need to show that the air quality in their district or in their city has really improved. There has been a number of cases of where the local officials faked the numbers. So the environment is bad, but they want to get promoted, so they did something with the air monitor and faked the numbers. But all of those officials have been caught and then punished. So, okay, so let's...
Which years you are talking about, these studies of local officials faking their data?
Recent,
Even
not...
now, it's continuing.
It's happening less and less because the Ministry for Environmental Protection is given now a lot of resources, also employees, so they have the capacity to check in each city to do inspections. So that example I mentioned happened in 2017 in a city called Xi'an. So 7 officials were found guilty by doing something. They put a cotton ball in the air monitors so the monitor produced good numbers. So let me just talk about Delhi. I think you all know Delhi better than me. So for Delhi, the sources of pollution are more diverse. So there are cars, probably also coal, and also crop burning in Punjab, in the surrounding regions. And then construction dust. So it's compared to Beijing, Beijing is mostly coal and cars, but Delhi has more diverse sources, which means it's harder, it's more difficult to improve air quality because you have to deal with all these different sources and simultaneously. So so this is how this is the picture. It's a summary. So the main actor in the clean air campaigns in Delhi is really not government, not the industries, but environmental NGOs. And there's one very active NGO. It's called Center for Environment and Science, CICS, right? Yeah. So they've been doing a lot of work in the field. And then, so what they do, yes, I have a picture. So this is a picture I took in front of their office, somewhere not a bit far from here in Delhi. So what they do is they are very good at public interest litigation. They basically, in the 1990s, they mobilized with other activists. Then they approached the Supreme Court for just one cause. They wanted to convert the fuel used in public vehicles from diesel to clean natural gas. And then the Supreme Court in India has a very strong activist tendency. So the Supreme Court actually organized a study to see how dirty the diesel was in the 1990s. And they found that it's really dirty. And then by the year of 2002, they forced the Delhi government to implement, and then all the public vehicles changed from using diesel to clean natural gas. So that was 2002. But since then, there hasn't been any major victory. So that was the last milestone in the fight for clean air. So the main actor is NGOs, but also the Supreme Court, and the government, Delhi government, hasn't taken any action. This is Delhi's Clean Air Action Plan. It's a thin, small pamphlet, and the action plan was prepared by this NGO, Center for Environment and Science, and the Delhi government didn't respond to the plan, and so it's proposed by an NGO, so there's no funding. So there are different proposals, but the NGO can't say, who should be responsible for these different measures. So there's no funding, and it's not clear who should be in charge, and therefore the gap in terms of air quality between the two cities has really widened. 2 years ago, the World Health Organization did a second study of air quality across the world, 1,400 cities across the world. And among the top 20 most polluted cities, 14 are from India. And there's 1 from China, 2 from Pakistan, and then the rest are from a few African countries. So that report really shows the consequence of lack of action from the government. So I'm going to finish here. So that's I have 3 different case studies in the book: housing, land acquisition, and air pollution. But the big argument I'm trying to make in the book is not everything can be explained by regime types, democracy or non-democracy. There's much more going on. So in terms of urban governance, one of the main differences is the territorial and associational approach to mobilization, also policy making and implementation. Oh, I spoke too long, sorry. Sorry. So any questions, I would be happy to answer. Yes, please.
I was hoping you would share some insights on the intra- and intercity migration rules in China, which I believe helps to maintain an even demographic distribution, thereby facilitating good local governance.
Mm-hmm.
Are there some stringent migration rules in China, residential and migration rules, prohibiting intercity and intracity migration?
Okay, so there's rural to rural, rural, urban, urban, rural, and then urban, urban, so 4 different. But the predominant one is rural to urban. So in terms of geographical spatial patterns, it's from inland provinces to the coastal provinces, because the coastal provinces are more developed, so there are more job opportunities. So that has been the pattern for the last 20 years, but there's some new trend. So a lot of small towns in China today are developing well, and migrant workers, so they don't get like hukou in big cities. So now the new trend is people are not leaving their hometowns anymore. If there are opportunities nearby, so if they don't need to travel that far to get a job, then they don't. So there's a lot of factories along the coast are actually having a shortage of labor because the migration is slowing down in China. It has to do with the one-child policy, but also it has to do with the level of development in the inland provinces. The gap is getting smaller, so there's less incentive to be so far away from home. That's
I wanted to ask actually, does the state enforce any sort of
migration
impose any sort of restrictions?
restrictions.
Does the state enforce
The state doesn't force people to stay or move. There's no restriction, but there are policies that discourage people from settling down in cities. So that's the hukou system. But again, it's not. We shouldn't generalize. So the hukou system is most restrictive in the top tier cities, Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. So it's very hard to get local hukou. But in the second tier cities, it's not that hard anymore to get a local hukou. So I'm from a city called Harbin in the northeast. It has probably 6-7 million people, second or maybe third tier. I would say second tier city. So in that city, if you buy an apartment, doesn't matter how expensive or cheap, if you purchase some property, then you get local hukou. So Harbin has attracted a lot of migrants from the rest of the province. So I think the short answer to your question is it depends on which region or which city. So there are restrictions, a lot of restrictions in the big cities because everybody wants to be there. But in the rest of the country, it's not much. Yes. Okay.
So I have two questions. First related to migration and second to pollution. A few months back I saw a video about Hong Kong and there were like illegal migrants in Hong Kong from all over Asia. But the government doesn't know. Like they say that they don't know, but it was all over YouTube. So I wanted to know like how does, and they have like settled in such areas only like in such slums in Hong Kong. But how does the government tackle this problem? And my second question is related to pollution. So, do you provide any alternative for the pre-existing governmental policies to like eradicate or even like to lessen the pollution levels? Or could India adopt what China is doing right now? I just wanted to know.
Okay. So I'll talk about the second one first. Can India do something that China has been doing? I think definitely yes. The problem is the Delhi government isn't doing anything. I mean, there's odd even scheme, but it didn't last. I think the traffic police in Delhi doesn't have the capacity to check on every license plate. And also even during those 2 weeks when they tried the odd even scheme, there were so many exceptions. But the first step, I think, for India is information, to have data. I don't know how many air monitors there are in the city right now, but I think a lot of them are not working. So the first step is to have data, and the second is to give access, so to let people have access to the data, so they know how bad the air is. And then the next step is, people will demand for more action. But one of the puzzles I have is why air pollution hasn't become politicized. Almost everything in this country is so politicized, and air pollution affects everybody. So it can be an issue, that mobilize people across, class, across castes, different occupations. Maybe it's a matter of time. Maybe in a few years from now, there will be a Green Party. So I don't know why air pollution hasn't become a political issue. So your first question about immigrants in Hong Kong, Hong Kong is there's a lot going on these days in Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was returned to China, the Chinese government agreed with that one country, two system policy. So for migrant workers in Hong Kong, the policies are very different. Hong Kong doesn't have hukou, so I assume the migrants have to obtain some permit to work and stay.
So they're illegal. So the government doesn't know if they register with the government or if they go for getting their document, they'll be kicked out of the country. So they're living in a very bad situation right now. There are NGOs who are supporting them, but yeah.
Yeah, and Hong Kong.
Legally settled.
Yes, but I don't know the details. But the policies are Hong Kong. It's like a autonomous. It's called SAR, Special Autonomous Region. So there are two SARs, Hong Kong and Macau. So they can make their own laws, different from mainland China. Yes, go ahead.
Making comparative analysis of Beijing, Guangzhou and Wuhan from PRC and Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata from India. So what are the common parameters you are taken to make a comparative analysis?
Common parameters for what?
In order to select these 6 cities.
Oh, that's very good question. How there's so many cities to choose from. So why did I choose these 6? Very good question, and I'll try to be brief. So for the air pollution case, I picked Beijing and Delhi not because these 2 cities are the most polluted, because they are not. There are places in both countries that have really far worse air quality. So I chose these 2 cases because most of the policy action or environmental, whatever the action, the policies, also legislation, are taking place in the capitals, and then the rest of the country are following what Beijing and Delhi has been doing. And for the housing case, I chose Mumbai and Guangzhou for a number of reasons. Well, the obvious reason is both cities have the largest proportion of the local residents living in informal settlements, slums or urban villages. But also the 2 cities are the pioneers in China and India for experimenting private sector-led redevelopment. So that's why I picked these 2. So for Delhi is doing now what Mumbai did or started doing 20, 30 years ago. Which is basically inviting a private developer to resettle residents and then give the land to the developers. And then for the land disputes, I chose Wukan and Singer not because they are representative. I don't think you can make an argument on how the cases are representative if you have only a very small number of cases. So I chose these 2 cases because first of all, the stories are very rich, so it's a good story to tell. And second, these are the rare cases where the locals somehow have managed to block the land deals, especially for the Chinese case. Wukan is probably one of the few places in the country where the locals stopped. They didn't get everything, but they got some land back. Yeah, so it's a success story in a way. So, but I can't say that these 2 or 6 cases are representative of the 2 countries. There's just so much variation. Both countries are so big. So I think if you do a small number, like case studies. At least for me, we just have to be humble and then acknowledge the limitations. How much I can generalize from these small number of cases. But thank you for the question. Very good. Yeah. Yes.
Like a dissertation committee member, right? The
Sorry?
question was like a dissertation committee member.
Oh, okay.
But one of the things, a small question that I had is in Beijing, there's been a really, I don't know, like rapid is enough also, expansion of public transport system, including metro and other
Yes.
options. So, is there a reduction in cars there? And so in that sense, the source of pollution, which you identified cars and coal plants, are they now contributing to less pollution in total, or have the cars become better in the sense the emission norms have become more stricter? So where is that story?
Okay, I think I don't know, but that's easy to find out. Beijing has a very so there. If you compare with Shanghai and Guangzhou, other big Chinese cities, Beijing has the least restrictive policies for car ownership. For Shanghai, it's by auction. So every month there's a very small number of license plates available. People can afford to get a car, but you need to get a license plate. So in Shanghai today, probably it's how much? More than $50,000 to get a license plate. It doesn't matter how cheap or expensive. It doesn't matter if you have a car or not. So the car ownership in Shanghai is low because people don't want to spend that much money for a piece of metal. But Beijing doesn't have that. But Beijing has a lottery system. And so you can, if you don't win the lottery, then next month you try. So and the odd even scheme has been effective since the Olympics. So if you have a car, you can only drive 3 days out of 7. So that actually encouraged people to get a second car, so they can buy a second car, have a number with the odd or even, so then they have their week covered. So I don't know the numbers, but I think the expansion of the metro system didn't help much. So people still want to have cars.
Transportation was never number one source in pollution.
No, pollution. She said cars and coal in terms of source of pollution.
Coal, but not cars.
But coal could be, unlike you said, in Beijing,
it's coal burning.
These are the two major sources of pollution.
Right, yeah.
Versus Delhi, you said, which is even more money.
Right, yes. Yeah.
So you feel that there's, so they achieved the reduction only by by reducing emissions from coal plants, and not as much from cars. Is that?
Yeah, it's easy to shut down coal plants, but the problem is the the plants that use coal, they don't go that far, so they move to the surrounding provinces. And when the wind blows from the north, then all the fuel is back in the city. So different challenges. But in terms of the metro, the problem is you probably heard the last mile problem. When you get off the metro, if you have to walk 30 minutes, then you want to get a car. Nobody wants to walk 30 minutes. So maybe, I don't know, if you ask economists, they will say, if you put a price on things, then it will change. Thank you for the question. Anything?
Okay. It's in our hands. One more question, then maybe I can talk. No, I like a small comment. I think with regarding to access to data. I think it's. This is after a lot of thinking. This is my hunch. One of the things what you said about why pollution is not politicized. I think For a larger number of people, by that I'm saying lower middle class and down, which is numerous in Delhi. Pollution is an ordinary everyday fact. So when there is actually the spike which is then noticed by journalists or whatever, is not really, how to say, that different. Pollution, a little bit more. Versus, I think the kind of this, a little bit more conscious, or and that I think is evident in the localities if you go in there. So monitors will report, Central Delhi is better and things like that. But you go to a place called Lodi Road, and in Lodi Road there are certain alleys and localities where you actually can smell, the pollution is distinct. Versus you cross a kilometer and then there is nice green garden. So I think that is my hunch that when it is during Diwali time or when there's crop burning, that increase for them is not really significant increase. I think for a lot of people, only for a select few, it is a big jump from less pollution. So if you are in Khan Market, India Gate and things like that, it's a big spike. But in other places, I feel it is still not a big difference. So whether you need whether you actually I don't think for pollution actually you need data. People can feel it. For example, my brother lives in Bangalore, and everyone knows Bangalore becomes polluted. He says simply thing like the cloth on your is evidence every day that you are commuting, you're walking, you're going through pollution. So data or no data,
but
the kind of how is the consciousness of data? You're feeling it. We don't need to be told, on a TV monitor that this much pollution.
Right.
With a good measure, with a good stick.
Yeah. A lot of Chinese residents have an app in their phone, so they do check. They can see and then they check and see, oh, the numbers. Then I don't go out. So,
and I think also
Delhi, I think the smog is the most evident way. A smog is there everywhere. So I think that is very obvious that the air pollution levels are very high. And people get sick, the kind of the number of cases in the hospitals, the asthma attacks, and all the public health indicators are also there. They're actually kind of, I don't know if you look at public health data, but there are certain indicators that show that pollution.
Lung capacity of young school children now is really poor. Possibly in this area also, I have not checked of my children, but I should do that. It so happened a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, had to observe in the court saying that, my grandson roams around in the house, with a mask, like Superman or Batman or something like that. So I think we feel that, the data, there is a consciousness, but I think it's my hunch in terms of, how it might not be politicized, I think is this gap, between a large number of people who are experiencing, I think, tremendous levels of pollution, and that spike is, for them it might not be like, oh, it's a little bit more rainy day, like every day is a rainy day, and that's a more rainy day kind of thing. It's not driving everyone to.
But in general, environmental movement, consciousness is a very middle class phenomena in India.
Exactly. So that's why they, are able I think, in television to shout loud.
Yes.
That Delhi today is bad, but the whole past week has been bad for the larger number of people.
Yes.
I think actually my comment, one comment. Actually, I think the case of pollution is quite fine. I support your argument on the associate norm and against territory code like in India and China. Because for me, I think for this it's much more difficult to handle the pollution issue. Like this is 3 level. First, they have some cooperation between the state government and the central government. And also Delhi and the surrounding states, they have the cooperation there, and also pollution's effect on the people are different from different sections of the people. Maybe the citizens, from the middle and upper class, they care much about pollution, but people from lower class, they may care about their livelihood. So these things, it could be a good example to support your argument.
Yes.
What is the two difference?
I agree. It's a good example.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.